I didn't cry when my father sold me to the devil. I remember standing in front of the mirror that morning, my reflection blurred by the steam from the shower I hadn't taken, my skin cold beneath the silk robe that someone, probably the housekeeper who pitied me, had laid out on my bed the night before, and I thought about how quiet everything felt, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if I would break. But I didn't. Not when my father told me the Valenti family had agreed to the union. Not when he said, with the calm detachment of a man discussing business, that my marriage would be the final payment for the debt he owed. No, I didn't cry then. I saved my tears for later, when no one could see, when the house fell silent, and the taste of betrayal sat heavy on my tongue like ash. The dress they gave me was beautiful, of course. Ivory silk that shimmered faintly under the church lights, stitched by hand in Milan. Delicate lace at the sleeves that looked like cobwebs spun by angels. It was the kind of dress every little girl dreamed of wearing one day. Except I felt like I was wearing someone else's life, walking someone else's path, smiling in someone else's story. My body moved, but my soul stayed behind, watching from a distance, whispering, "Run." But where was I supposed to go? When your father sells you to a man like Lorenzo Valenti, there are no places left to hide. The church was cold, a cavern of marble and stained glass, the kind of place that demanded reverence even from the faithless. The pews were filled with faces I didn't know, men in tailored suits, their wives draped in diamonds, all of them watching with polite curiosity as the sacrificial lamb made her slow walk down the aisle. I remember thinking how strange it was, that they smiled, that they looked at me as though I were lucky, as though marrying a man like Lorenzo was some twisted fairy tale come true. And then I saw him. He stood at the altar like a shadow carved from stone, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black suit that looked sharper than sin. His face was unreadable, the kind of beauty that hurt to look at for too long, too harsh, too cold, too controlled. His dark hair slicked back, his jaw cut from marble, his eyes. God, those eyes. They weren't just dark, they were a storm, silent but heavy with things unsaid. He didn't smile when he saw me, didn't offer even a pretense of charm. He simply watched, as if he were assessing damage, as if I were something broken he was forced to claim. And when I reached him, when the priest began his sanctified script, when everyone in that room leaned forward to witness the joining of two empires, that's when he spoke the words that would burn themselves into my skin forever. Don't expect love from me. He said it quietly, so only I could hear, his voice low and smooth, the kind of voice that could command armies or destroy lives. And I, foolish and trembling and proud, looked up at him and whispered back, "I wouldn't dare." He blinked once, as if surprised, but the faintest curl of something, amusement maybe, touched his lips. It was gone before I could be sure. Then he turned back to the priest. The ring slid onto my finger, and the deal was sealed with a kiss that wasn't a kiss at all. His lips brushed mine, cold and fleeting, a transaction disguised as affection. The church applauded. My father exhaled in relief, and I felt something inside me go still. Later, when the crowd dispersed and the champagne flowed, I found myself standing alone in the courtyard, staring at the white roses that bloomed around the fountain. The night air was cool against my skin, the sky painted in shades of indigo and quiet despair. I tried to breathe, to feel something, joy, fear, anger, but all I felt was numbness, the kind that comes from too many sacrifices made in silence. That's when I saw him again, leaning against a stone pillar, cigarette between his fingers, smoke curling around him like a halo of sin. Lorenzo Valenti, my husband, my captor, my curse. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, not looking at me, his voice cutting through the night like a blade wrapped in silk. "Should I ask your permission now too?" I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. He turned his gaze toward me, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something. surprise, maybe even admiration, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He dropped the cigarette, crushed it beneath his shoe, and stepped closer, so close I could feel the heat of his body through the fragile layers of satin and lace. "You'll learn quickly, Mrs. Valenti," he murmured, his breath ghosting over my ear, "that in my world permission isn't requested, it's taken." I wanted to hate him then. I wanted to scream, to claw at the perfect suit, to demand why me? Why this? Why must I be the pawn in a war I never started? But when I looked up at him, I saw something that silenced every word. His eyes, beneath all that ice and control, held something fragile, something almost broken, and I hated that I wanted to understand it, because monsters weren't supposed to look human when they stood this close. When we left the church, it was already night. The car that waited for us was black and gleaming, the driver silent as the grave. My father shook Lorenzo's hand with trembling gratitude, and I watched them. Two men exchanging my future like a signed contract. I caught my father's eyes one last time, searching for any sign of regret, any flicker of the love he used to have for me. But all I saw was exhaustion, and the faintest whisper of guilt that came too late. As the car door closed behind me, the world outside faded into a blur of city lights and rain-speckled glass. Lorenzo sat beside me, hands clasped, staring out the window. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us was suffocating, heavy with everything that had been. Lost and everything that was about to begin. I glanced down at the ring on my finger. It fit perfectly, too perfectly, as if even fate had conspired to trap me here. The gold band gleamed in the dim light, mocking me with its promise of forever. He finally spoke, voice soft but edged with warning. "Whatever fantasies you had about marriage, erase them now. I don't play house. I don't share my life. You're here because your father owes me. Nothing more." I turned to face him, forcing a steadiness I didn't feel. "Then I suppose we understand each other, Mr. Valenti. I'm not here for love either." His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking in his cheek, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw the ghost of a smirk. But he said nothing else. When we arrived at the Valenti estate, a sprawling mansion that rose from the hills like some dark cathedral, he stepped out first, offering no hand, no courtesy. I followed, clutching my skirts, my heart thudding in my chest as the iron gates closed behind us, with a sound that felt final, almost funereal. The air smelled of rain and gunmetal. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. I looked up at the mansion, its black windows staring down like eyes that had seen too much, and I knew, in that moment, that I had crossed a line I could never return from. Because the devil doesn't make promises he doesn't intend to keep. And Lorenzo Valenti had promised me nothing at all. The Valenti mansion was not a home. It was a cathedral built for ghosts. The moment I stepped through its towering doors, I felt the air change, heavy, dense, as though the walls themselves held their breath in eternal mourning. The marble floors gleamed beneath the dim chandelier light, each tile reflecting pieces of my face like a broken mirror, and the silence was so complete it became a sound of its own. A low, humming thing that crawled beneath my skin and made me want to scream just to prove I still existed. Lorenzo walked ahead of me, his long stride echoing softly, his black suit swallowing the faint light, as if even illumination dared not touch him too boldly. He didn't look back to see if I followed. He didn't need to. He already knew I would. Fear, after all, was a leash stronger than any vow. "Mrs. Valenti," a voice said softly from the right, and I turned to see an older woman standing in the foyer, her hair pinned in a tight bun, her eyes weary but kind. "Welcome. I'm Carmela. I take care of the household." She smiled, but there was pity in it. That quiet, restrained pity reserved for the condemned. I nodded, unable to find my voice, and followed Lorenzo as he gestured for her to take my luggage. The hallways stretched endlessly, each one lined with portraits of men whose faces bore the same arrogance, the same sharp cheekbones and cold eyes that now belonged to my husband. Generations of Valentis, each staring down at me as if they knew exactly what kind of bargain had brought me here. Lorenzo stopped at the base of the grand staircase, his hand resting on the banister. "This is your home now," he said, his tone devoid of warmth, as though the word home were a mere formality. "You'll have your own room. Meals are served at 8 in the morning and 8 at night. You'll eat with me when I say so. Otherwise, you'll eat alone." It was a declaration, not an invitation. I wanted to ask what he did all day, where he disappeared to when the shadows swallowed him, why there was a sadness beneath his cruelty that didn't quite fit, but I bit my tongue. The air between us was fragile, sharp-edged, and I knew one wrong word would cut. He continued, "There are areas of the house that are off-limits. You will not go near the West Wing under any circumstances." His gaze locked on mine, dark and unwavering, and the weight of it made my stomach twist. "Do you understand?" I nodded, though the defiance in me stirred like a caged bird. There was something deliberate about the way he said it, as if daring me to be curious. "The staff will show you to your quarters," he said simply, and without another glance, he turned and disappeared down a dim corridor, his footsteps fading until all that was left was silence and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock at the end of the hall. Carmela led me upstairs, speaking softly about where everything was, about how to summon help if I needed anything, but her words washed over me like static. My mind was elsewhere, caught on the way Lorenzo's hand had lingered briefly on the banister, on the way his jaw had tightened when he spoke of that forbidden wing, as though the very mention of it drew blood. The room they'd prepared for me was beautiful in a way that felt sterile. White curtains, pale furniture, and a bed large enough to hold 100 dreams, though I doubted I would have any. I walked to the window, pulled back the drapes, and stared at the view. The grounds stretched endlessly, manicured gardens, fountains, and the faint glimmer of the city lights far below. But beyond the beauty, there was something suffocating, as if invisible bars caged it all. When Carmela left, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of it all crush me. I was alone, not just physically, but utterly. I thought of my father, probably celebrating his renewed fortunes while I tried to breathe in a house that smelled faintly of smoke and secrets. I thought of Lorenzo, the man I had married but did not know, and of his warning that love would not live here. And I wondered if he said it because he was incapable of it, or because love had once lived here and died screaming. As the night deepened, I wandered the halls, barefoot and restless. The house groaned softly, old wood shifting beneath the weight of time. I traced my fingers along the wallpaper, feeling the patterns like veins under my touch. Every hallway looked the same. Every shadow seemed to move. When I turned away. Then I reached a corridor I hadn't seen before. It was darker than the others, colder too, the air heavy with dust and neglect. A faint draft brushed against my cheek, carrying the scent of iron and something else, something that made my heart beat faster. At the end of that corridor was a heavy oak door, the Red Wing. I knew it before I even touched it. The door was locked, of course, but I pressed my palm against it anyway. The wood was cold, almost icy, and I thought I heard something, a faint hum, like a whisper trapped inside the walls. My breath fogged in front of me, though there was no reason it should. "Don't." The voice came from behind me, low and dangerous, and I froze. Lorenzo stood in the shadows, his face half lit by the dim hallway light, his expression unreadable but his eyes burning with quiet fury. He moved toward me, slow, measured steps that made the air thicken with each one. "I told you that wing is off limits," he said, his voice soft but lethal, the kind of tone that could turn a command into a threat. "I was just curious?" he interrupted, stepping closer until the scent of his cologne, smoke and whiskey and something darker, filled my lungs. "Curiosity is what kills in this house, Serena." Hearing my name on his tongue did strange things to me. It sounded foreign, dangerous, like he was tasting it for the first time. "I wasn't going to go in," I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. His gaze lingered on me for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe me. Then, to my surprise, he exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders loosening just enough for humanity to slip through. "There are things in this house that should stay buried," he said, softer now, almost weary. "For your sake, don't dig them up." He turned to leave, but then paused, his profile cast in shadow. "Good night, Mrs. Valenti." And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I stood there long after, staring at the door, my heartbeat loud in the silence. What could be behind it that made even a man like Lorenzo so careful, so guarded? Back in my room, I lay awake, listening to the wind scrape against the windows, to the distant sound of footsteps that didn't always seem to belong to me. The mansion felt alive, not with warmth, but with memory. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this place was a graveyard of secrets, and I had just touched one. The morning after the warning about the Red Wing, I woke to silence so thick it felt like a second skin. A silence that didn't merely fill the house, but seemed to pulse within its walls. A living thing that fed on secrets and restraint, and for a long time I simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, wondering how a place so grand could make me feel so small. The sunlight filtered weakly through the gauzy curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced like fragments of forgotten prayers, and for a moment, I could almost pretend I was somewhere else, in a home that was warm, in a life that had belonged to me, before vows spoken in front of strangers, and a man whose voice could freeze the air around him turned everything I knew into something unrecognizable. I rose slowly, the satin sheets whispering against my skin, and crossed to the window that overlooked the gardens, where men in dark suits moved like shadows, purposeful and quiet, guarding not a home but a fortress. Every gesture they made was sharp, precise, controlled, the kind of discipline born not from duty, but from fear of the man who commanded them. Lorenzo Valenti's world was ruled by silence and obedience, and I, though wearing his name, was merely another captive inside it. Breakfast was served in a sunroom that had long forgotten the meaning of its name. The windows were high and arched, the light pale and cold, and the long mahogany table stretched out like a barrier between us when Lorenzo finally appeared, immaculate as always, not a single hair out of place, not a flicker of emotion on that impossibly beautiful face that might have belonged to an angel if not for the darkness in his eyes. He didn't speak at first, just sat across from me, reading something on his phone while I stared down at my plate, pretending interest in the untouched food, the clink of silverware against porcelain, the only sound breaking the unbearable quiet. Finally, he looked up. "You were wandering the house last night," he said, not asking but stating, his voice low and even, like the calm before a storm that doesn't care whether you're ready for it. "I couldn't sleep," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady, though the memory of his shadowed face in that forbidden corridor still lingered like a bruise I couldn't touch. "You'll sleep better if you stay where you belong," he replied, his gaze holding mine, and though his tone was not cruel, there was an authority beneath it that left no space for defiance, the kind that made you feel like even breathing without permission might be a sin. Something inside me rebelled at that, not because I wanted to challenge him, but because the way he spoke made me feel invisible, as though I were a possession he'd acquired rather than a person he'd married. I set down my fork with deliberate care and said, "And where exactly do I belong, Lorenzo? In the rooms you give me? At the times you decide? Living by rules I never agreed to?" His eyes darkened, and though his face didn't move, I felt the shift in the air between us, sharp and electric, the warning hum of a predator deciding whether to strike. "You belong here," he said quietly, each word carved with precision, "as my wife, and that means you will follow my rules, not because I enjoy making them, but because they keep you alive." Alive. The word struck me harder than I expected. Alive, as if my survival were a matter of his design, not my will. as if the danger surrounding him were not a story whispered in back rooms, but something that breathed, that waited, that watched from the shadows beyond the estate walls. Still, I couldn't help myself. "And if I don't?" I asked, my voice softer now, not quite defiant, but close enough. His lips curved slightly. Not a smile, not really. More a fleeting echo of amusement laced with something darker. "Then you'll learn what happens to people who mistake freedom for safety." He stood then, pushing his chair back with a grace that shouldn't have belonged to a man so dangerous, and for a heartbeat, as he walked past me, I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Not anger, but weariness, like a man tired of fighting battles no one could see. He paused by the door, his hand on the frame, and said without looking back, "Stay away from the West Wing, Serena. It's not a request." And then he was gone, leaving me with my untouched breakfast and a heart that beat too fast for reasons I didn't want to name. The hours after that blurred into a haze of restless pacing and half-formed thoughts. I explored the parts of the mansion I was allowed to see, the library with its towering shelves and scent of leather and dust, the music room that hadn't heard laughter in years, the gallery lined with paintings of battles won and blood spilled, each brushstroke whispering that this family was built on power and loss. Everywhere I went, eyes followed me. The staff moved quietly, politely, but there was something in their glances, a mix of sympathy and fear, as if they too knew that this house belonged not to the living but to the weight of what had been lost. By afternoon, I found myself back in the sunroom, the one place that at least offered light, though it filtered weakly through the glass as if the sun itself hesitated to touch this place. I had a book open in my lap but hadn't turned a page, my mind circling the same thought over and over. What could be so terrible in the West Wing that even Lorenzo's control wavered at the mention of it? I knew I shouldn't care. I knew curiosity was a dangerous luxury in his world, but I had already begun to learn something about myself, that fear and fascination often shared the same heartbeat. When evening came, there was a dinner, formal, lavish, attended by a handful of men whose names I didn't catch, but whose gazes told me everything I needed to know. They looked at Lorenzo with reverence, with a kind of loyalty born not from love, but from survival, and they looked at me with curiosity, the way one might look at a creature dragged in from the cold to sit beside a king. I sat quietly beside him, listening to their low voices discussing shipments, alliances, and something about the Rossetti family, a name that made Lorenzo's eyes harden just slightly, enough for me to notice. At one point, one of the men, young, handsome, and foolish, lifted his glass and said, "To Mrs. Valenti. Brave, to marry a man like our boss." Laughter rippled through the room, low and knowing, and before I could stop myself, I said softly, "Bravery has nothing to do with it. Some of us aren't given choices." The laughter died immediately. Silence followed, sharp as a blade. Lorenzo's gaze turned to me then, slow, deliberate, and I felt the air shift, the way a room changes when the storm outside suddenly finds a door open. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost tender, which made it all the more terrifying. "Disobedience," he murmured, his eyes on mine, "has consequences, Mrs. Valenti." The men looked away. No one laughed again. The dinner ended soon after, and I walked out into the hall with my pulse racing, not sure if I wanted to scream or cry or both. He caught up to me at the foot of the stairs, his presence filling the space before he even spoke. "You think I enjoy being cruel?" he asked, voice low, strained, almost human for a fleeting second. "Every word I speak, every order I give is because if I don't, someone else will, and they won't stop at words." I turned to him then, my breath shallow, and whispered, "Then why marry me at all?" He stared at me for a long moment, and for the first time I saw it, a shadow of something behind his eyes, something that looked too much like pain. "Because," he said softly, "some debts can only be paid in blood or vows." And before I could ask what he meant, he was gone again, swallowed by the darkness that always seemed to follow him. I stood there, the silence pressing against me, and I realized something terrifying. I didn't just want answers anymore. I wanted to know him, even if it destroyed me. I have always believed that silence can be as dangerous as a loaded gun, and in the days that followed that dinner, the silence in the Valenti mansion grew heavier, thicker, like a fog that seeped into every room, clinging to the walls and curling around my thoughts, until even my own heartbeat sounded like an intrusion. The house itself seemed to breathe differently after that night. The staff moving more cautiously, their footsteps lighter, their conversations quieter, as if the air had changed and everyone could feel the invisible pressure that hung above us, pressing down, suffocating, and inescapable. Lorenzo avoided me after that, though perhaps avoided isn't the right word. It was more that he became even more of a ghost than before, vanishing into his study at dawn and reappearing only after dark, his presence heralded by the faint scent of smoke and the subtle tightening in the air that always came before he entered a room. When I did see him, he was composed, distant, every movement deliberate, every word measured, as though control was not just a habit, but a form of survival. And yet, despite his distance, or maybe because of it, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way his hands trembled ever so slightly when he poured his whiskey. The way he stared out the window at night, long after the world outside had gone to sleep. His gaze unfocused, fixed on something only he could see. The way the light caught the faint scar along his jaw, a mark that didn't look like an accident, but rather like the remnant of violence long past. There was a story in every inch of him, written in scars and silence, and though I told myself I wanted nothing to do with it, I couldn't stop wanting to read it. One night, long after midnight, I woke to a sound I couldn't place. A low, broken noise that drifted through the thin veil of sleep and pulled me upright before I even understood what it was. The house was dark, the kind of dark that felt alive, and for a long moment, I just listened. Then I heard it again, a voice, rough and raw, echoing faintly down the corridor. I followed the sound barefoot, the cold marble biting at my skin, the air thick with that strange blend of fear and curiosity that always seemed to guide me toward danger. The closer I came, the clearer it became. A man's voice, heavy with anguish, repeating a single name like a prayer or a curse. Matteo, Matteo. The sound led me to Lorenzo's study, the door slightly ajar, a thin ribbon of light spilling into the hall. I hesitated, every rational part of me screaming to turn back. But something stronger, something foolishly human, pushed me forward. Inside, the room was dim, the air smelling faintly of whiskey and smoke, the fire in the hearth casting restless shadows that danced across the walls. Lorenzo sat on the leather couch, head in his hands, his usually immaculate hair disheveled, his shirt half unbuttoned, the controlled mask he wore in daylight shattered by whatever ghosts haunted him now. For the first time since I had met him, he didn't look powerful. He looked broken. I should have left. I should have turned and walked back to my room and pretended I hadn't seen anything. But I didn't. I took a slow step forward, my heart pounding so loudly I thought he'd hear it, and whispered, "Lorenzo?" He didn't move at first, just inhaled sharply, as though the sound of my voice pulled him back from some terrible edge. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't the eyes of the man who'd threatened me across polished dinner tables. They were raw, haunted, unguarded in a way that made me feel like I'd stumbled into something sacred and forbidden all at once. "Go back to bed," he said hoarsely, his voice stripped of its usual authority, trembling like a man fighting an invisible war. "You were having a nightmare," I murmured, stepping closer despite myself. "You said a name. Matteo. Who is he?" His gaze sharpened at once, the softness vanishing like a candle snuffed out by wind, replaced by that cold, impenetrable mask I was beginning to recognize as his armor. "That's none of your concern," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, and I knew that I'd touched something he didn't want touched, Still, I didn't retreat. I knelt beside the couch, close enough to feel the heat from the fire flicker against my skin, close enough to see the fine tremor in his hands as he tried to steady them. It sounded like pain, I whispered. Like loss. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he'd order me out, but instead, he let out a breath that sounded almost like defeat. He stared into the fire as he spoke, his words slow, deliberate, as if each one cost him something. Matteo was my brother, he said at last, his voice so low I almost missed it. Younger by 4 years. He was supposed to inherit nothing, be free from this life. But he wanted to prove himself. He made a deal, one I told him not to make. He paused, his fingers curling into fists, the flames casting sharp lines across his face. When the Rossettis betrayed us, he was caught in the middle. They wanted me. They took him instead. He swallowed hard, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked, the words ragged and full of the kind of pain that time never dulls. I found what was left of him 3 days later, and I have been finding pieces of myself missing ever since. The room was silent, except for the crackle of the fire and the distant beat of my own heart. I didn't know what to say. There were no words for that kind of grief, no language soft enough to touch it without breaking it further. So I did the only thing I could. I reached out, my hand trembling, and rested it on his arm. For a heartbeat, he went completely still. Then slowly, his muscles relaxed beneath my touch, and he looked at me, really looked at me, as if trying to understand why someone like me, a woman he'd claimed as a transaction, would dare to touch him with tenderness. You shouldn't pity me, he said finally, his tone gentler now, almost resigned. Men like me don't deserve it. It isn't pity, I whispered, unable to pull my hand away. It's understanding. Something flickered in his eyes, something fragile, fleeting, before he turned away, the wall between us rising again, though not as high this time. You should sleep, he murmured. Tomorrow will be different. He didn't explain what he meant, and I didn't ask. When I finally left his study, the corridors felt different somehow, less suffocating, more alive. I knew I should feel relieved that he'd let me go so easily, but all I felt was the strange, unsettling pull of something beginning to shift between us, something neither of us could control. In my room, I stood at the window, watching the first hints of dawn touch the horizon. I thought about Lorenzo's voice breaking on his brother's name, about the way his hand trembled beneath mine, and for the first time, I wondered if his warning, "Don't expect love," from me, had been less of a threat and more of a confession. Because maybe love, for him, was not something he refused to give. Maybe it was something he believed he no longer had left. And as the sun began to rise, painting the world in pale gold, I made a silent promise to myself that I would find out what kind of man Lorenzo Valenti really was beneath all that ice and fury, even if doing so meant burning myself on the fire he kept hidden in his heart. I didn't know then that the moment I made that choice, everything in this house, and in me, began to change. There are moments in life when the air itself seems to hold its breath, when the world feels like it's waiting for something terrible to happen, and in the days that followed that night in Lorenzo's study, the silence of the Valenti mansion turned from uneasy to electric, as if the very walls had begun to sense the storm that was gathering beyond them. The atmosphere shifted in ways I couldn't quite define. The guards lingered closer to the house, their voices low and tense when they thought I wasn't listening. The staff moved faster, speaking less, their eyes darting toward windows as though expecting something to come crashing through the glass at any moment. And though no one said it aloud, I could feel it in my bones. Something was coming. Lorenzo himself was different. Colder, sharper, his movements more deliberate, his words more clipped, as though he had buried whatever softness had slipped through that night and locked it away again, behind layers of armor forged from control and guilt. But I had seen it, that flicker of humanity, the grief that cracked through the perfection of his mask, And now that I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it. It haunted me as much as it haunted him. He disappeared more frequently, leaving the mansion before sunrise, returning long after dark, his clothes still immaculate, but his eyes darker, heavier, as if the night carried secrets that clung to him even after he stepped through the door. I asked Carmela once where he went, and she only shook her head with that quiet, knowing sorrow that told me she had seen too much in her lifetime to believe that curiosity was ever harmless. He carries too much death on his shoulders already, she said softly. Don't try to carry it for him, child. But I couldn't help myself. That's what love does. Or maybe it wasn't love yet. Maybe it was fascination or pity, or that strange magnetism that draws the moth closer to the flame even as it feels its wings begin to burn. Whatever it was, it had already taken root inside me, spreading quietly through my veins, and no amount of logic or fear could make me stop wanting to understand the man I had been forced to call my husband. It happened on a night when the rain fell hard and relentless, drumming against the windows like desperate fingers trying to get in. The air smelled of smoke and lightning, and I couldn't sleep. The storm outside too loud, the storm inside me even louder. I left my room and wandered the halls, drawn by that restless energy that never seemed to let me rest in this house. Somewhere down the corridor, I heard voices, sharp, hushed, and urgent. I followed them, careful not to make a sound, until I reached the end of the west corridor, where the light from the wall sconces flickered uncertainly. Lorenzo's voice was low but unmistakable, the deep, smooth timbre that always seemed to vibrate straight through my chest when he spoke, and another voice, male, unfamiliar, rough with fear. They're moving tonight, the stranger whispered. The Rossettis. Word is they've got someone inside, a man close to your wife. For a moment there was silence, so complete I could hear the rain hitting the glass like beads of mercury. Then Lorenzo spoke, and the sound of his voice made my blood turn cold. If anyone touches her, he said quietly, there will be no truce, no negotiation. I will end their bloodline myself. The words were soft, but there was death in them. I backed away before I could hear more, heart pounding, and somehow made it back to my room, my mind spinning. A spy. Inside the house. Someone close to me. I couldn't think who it could be. The staff had been nothing but kind, distant but respectful, and I had barely spoken to anyone else. But fear is a clever thing. It doesn't need facts, only shadows, and by the time I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, every face in that mansion had become a suspect in my mind. I woke to chaos. A scream cut through the dawn, sharp, guttural, the kind that doesn't come from surprise but from pain. I ran to the window just in time to see movement in the garden, flashes of black coats, men shouting, gunfire cracking through the rain-soaked morning. I didn't think. I just ran, barefoot, through the halls, the cold floor biting at my skin, my heart slamming so hard against my ribs that I thought it would break free. The front doors were open, the air thick with gunpowder and rain, and I saw him, Lorenzo, standing at the center of it all, a weapon in his hand, his suit jacket soaked through, his hair slicked back by the storm, his face a portrait of fury and control so precise it was almost beautiful. He moved like something born from violence, every motion fluid, precise, final, the kind of grace that only comes from a man who has long made peace with death. I froze on the steps, the rain soaking through my nightgown, watching as he fired again and again, his expression unreadable, his body a weapon shaped by grief and rage. One of the attackers fell near the fountain, his blood mixing with the rain, turning the water red. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The surviving men scattered into the night, their tires screeching as they fled down the long drive, leaving behind bodies, smoke, and silence. Lorenzo lowered his weapon, his chest rising, and falling slowly, his head bowing for a moment, before he turned and saw me standing there. For a long second, neither of us spoke. The rain fell between us, a curtain of water and unspoken things. Then he walked toward me, his movements slow, deliberate, as though afraid that if he came too quickly, he might frighten me, or himself. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded, though his voice trembled in a way I'd never heard before. "You could have been killed." "I heard screaming," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I thought—" He closed the distance between us in 2 strides, his hand catching my wrist, his grip firm, but not cruel. "You don't think, Serena," he said, his eyes blazing, his voice raw. "You stay inside when I tell you to. You listen when I give you rules, because out here, disobedience doesn't just have consequences. It gets you killed." There was fury in his voice, yes, but beneath it, there was something else. Something that felt like fear, the kind that comes from imagining loss and realizing how close it came. I wanted to pull away, to tell him that I was tired of being treated like a fragile thing, that I was done living by rules I didn't understand. But when I looked up at him, I saw it. The faint tremor in his jaw, the way his fingers tightened just enough to betray what he wouldn't say aloud. "You were never supposed to matter," he murmured, his voice breaking softer now, almost as if the words themselves betrayed him. "You were supposed to be collateral, a name, a symbol. But when I saw that gun aimed toward the house—" He stopped himself, his eyes closing for the briefest second. When they opened again, the mask was back, the walls rebuilt, but I had already seen the fracture. "Go inside," he said quietly, releasing my wrist. "I'll take care of the rest." And though I should have obeyed, though I should have gone back into the warmth and safety of my gilded prison, I lingered, watching as he turned away, barking orders to his men, the rain turning his white shirt nearly transparent, the faint scar on his chest visible beneath the fabric. A scar shaped like a story he'd never told me. It was in that moment, standing there in the rain and chaos, that I realized how thin the line between fear and desire had become. Because no matter how much I told myself that this man was danger incarnate, that he was everything I had been warned against, there was something in the way he had said my name, something in the way his eyes had softened when he thought I might be hurt, that made me feel something terrifyingly close to safe. And I knew, deep down beneath the fear and confusion, that whatever had begun between us was no longer just survival or curiosity. It was the beginning of something neither of us would be able to control. The house was quieter that night than it had ever been, the kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, but instead hums with something restless and unsaid, a silence so deep that it felt like it was listening, waiting, breathing just beneath the surface of the walls. And I remember standing by my window, staring at the reflection of the rain still dripping from the glass, my mind caught between fear and something I didn't yet dare to name. It had been hours since the attack, hours since the chaos and the shouting, and the blood that painted the gardens red before the rain washed it away. But I could still feel it, the pulse of danger, the echo of Lorenzo's voice, the way his hand had closed around my wrist, not out of anger, but something that felt achingly close to desperation, as if the idea of me being hurt had struck him harder than he wanted to admit. I couldn't stop thinking about the way his eyes had softened for just a moment before he turned away. And though I told myself it was foolish to think that a man like him could care, there was a truth that pressed against my ribs, undeniable and wild. Something had changed between us in the rain. The clock in the hallway struck midnight. I turned from the window and found myself pacing, barefoot, the hem of my silk nightgown brushing against the floor, my heart caught in that strange rhythm that comes when the body knows something the mind refuses to acknowledge. The storm had passed, but inside me another was brewing, quiet but unrelenting, and I could no longer tell if what I felt was longing or madness. When I heard the footsteps outside my door, I thought for a moment I had imagined them. They were slow, steady, measured, the kind of steps that belonged to someone who never needed to rush, because the world always made room for him. The door didn't creak when it opened. Of course it didn't, because even the wood seemed to know better than to disobey him. And there he was, standing in the doorway, his presence filling the room before he even spoke, the dim light catching the faint sheen of his wet hair, the undone buttons of his shirt revealing a glimpse of the skin beneath, pale and scarred and human in a way I had never seen before. "Why are you awake?" he asked, his voice low, rougher than usual, as though the night had taken something from him too. I swallowed hard, the air suddenly too thick. "I couldn't sleep." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and the sound of the latch clicking felt heavier than it should have, as if that simple sound had locked us both inside something neither of us could escape. He didn't move closer at first, just stood there, watching me with that unreadable expression, the kind that made me feel like he was peeling away the layers of me without ever touching my skin. "You shouldn't have come outside today," he said quietly, and though his words were meant as reprimand, there was no real anger in them, only exhaustion. "You could have been killed." "I know," I whispered, though I didn't look away. "But I couldn't stay in that room knowing you were out there alone." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the movement revealing the tension in his shoulders, the faint tremor in his fingers that betrayed what he was trying so hard to hide. "You shouldn't care," he said, almost to himself, his tone distant, pained. "Caring gets people hurt." "Maybe," I said softly, taking a step toward him before I could stop myself. "But pretending not to care doesn't stop the pain either." Something in him broke then. Not loudly, not visibly, but I felt it in the way the air shifted between us, in the way his gaze darkened and softened all at once. He took a single step forward, and I swear the world tilted. "Serena," he said, my name low and rough on his tongue, and I don't know if it was the way he said it, or the way his voice cracked just slightly at the edges. But suddenly the distance between us felt unbearable. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper now, as if he were confessing to something sinful. "I've lived too long in blood and betrayal to understand what to do with someone like you." I could have told him that I didn't know how to do it either, that I didn't know how to love a man made of ice and fire, that I was terrified of him and of myself, but instead, I took another step forward until I was close enough to feel the heat of his breath on my skin. "Then don't think," I whispered. "Just feel." For a heartbeat, he didn't move, his body taut, his hands clenched at his sides like a man fighting a war against himself. And then, slowly, painfully, he gave in. His hand came up to my face, tentative at first, as if he feared I might shatter beneath his touch, and when his fingers brushed my cheek, I felt every part of me unravel. He tilted his forehead to mine, and the closeness was almost unbearable. The scent of rain still clinging to him, the warmth of his skin, the faint tremor in his breath as if the very act of being gentle cost him more than violence ever did. "You don't understand," he murmured, his lips so close I could feel the ghost of them against mine. "Everything I touch breaks." "Then break me," I whispered, and then he kissed me. It wasn't the kind of kiss that belonged to fairy tales or happy endings. It was desperate, consuming, the kind that spoke of pain and need and years of restraint collapsing all at once. His mouth was warm and rough against mine, his hands tracing the line of my jaw, my throat, the curve of my back, every movement hesitant at first, then hungrier, more certain, as if he had stopped fighting whatever it was that had been burning between us since the day we met. When he finally pulled away, his breath was ragged, his eyes dark with something that wasn't just desire. It was fear, longing, surrender. "I told you not to expect love from me," he said, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "And "Yet," I said, my voice trembling, "you're the only one I want it from." For a long time, neither of us spoke. He looked at me like a man standing at the edge of something vast and terrifying, and then, with a kind of resignation that was almost reverent, he touched my face again, slower this time, softer, as if memorizing what he knew he could never have. The night stretched endlessly around us, every second thick with the weight of what we were doing and what it meant. He was careful, impossibly so, his hands tracing my skin like he was afraid to hurt me, his breath catching every time I whispered his name. And though I had been his wife in name for weeks, it was only in that moment, in that quiet surrender, that I truly felt what it meant to belong to him. There was no cruelty in him that night, no commands, no walls, only need and regret, and a kind of fragile tenderness that felt foreign to both of us. And when he finally whispered my name again, it wasn't an order or a claim, it was a plea. Afterward, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I lay against him, my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It was the first time I had ever heard it, proof that beneath all the power and ruthlessness and fear, there was still a man who could bleed, still a heart that could feel. He thought I was asleep when he whispered, "God help me, Serena. You were never supposed to matter." But I heard him, and as I closed my eyes, I knew something irrevocable had shifted. Not just between us, but within him. Because even if he didn't know it yet, even if he refused to say the word, something had awakened inside Lorenzo Valenti that night. Something fierce and fragile and dangerous. Something like love. When I woke, the world felt heavier, quieter, as if even the air had changed overnight, as if the walls of the Valenti mansion had absorbed everything that had happened between us, and were now holding it close, whispering it back to me in fragments I couldn't quite bear to hear. The sheets beside me were still warm, the faint trace of his scent, smoke, whiskey, and rain, lingering like a secret too dangerous to keep, and for a long while I just lay there, eyes half open, tracing the patterns of light across the ceiling, wondering if it had all been real, or if I had dreamed it in some feverish moment between fear and longing. But when I turned, when I saw the indentation where his body had been, when I reached out and felt only emptiness, I knew. He was gone. There was no note, no sound, not even a whisper of a door closing. But the absence of him was so loud it roared through my chest like thunder, shaking something loose that I had tried for so long to keep contained. I sat up slowly, the sheets falling away from my bare skin. My heart beat a soft, unsteady rhythm that filled the silence, and I tried to remember the look on his face before he fell asleep, the way his eyes had softened, the way his hand had brushed my hair from my cheek, the way he had whispered my name like a promise he didn't know how to keep. I should have known he wouldn't stay. Men like Lorenzo Valenti didn't know how to wake up beside the things they wanted. They only knew how to destroy them or run from them. I rose from the bed, the cool air wrapping around me like a reminder of everything I wasn't supposed to feel, and crossed to the window. The dawn light spilled across the garden, pale and cold, the remnants of last night's storm still clinging to the ground like forgotten tears. The estate was already alive with movement, guards stationed at the gates, black cars idling near the fountain, men talking in hushed voices that carried just enough urgency to twist something deep inside my chest. Something was wrong. I dressed quickly, my hands trembling as I fastened the buttons of my blouse, and when I stepped into the hall, the air itself felt different, charged, brittle, as though the house was bracing for something it couldn't control. Carmela was waiting for me near the staircase, her expression solemn, her eyes avoiding mine in a way that made the world tilt slightly. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. She hesitated, wringing her hands in front of her apron. "He left before sunrise, Signora," she said softly, her tone careful, deliberate. "There was word from the city, business he could not postpone." "Business," I repeated, though the word tasted bitter in my mouth. "You mean the Rossettis?" She didn't answer, but the flicker in her eyes told me everything. A strange kind of panic began to bloom inside me then, slow and creeping, like smoke seeping through a locked door. I knew he lived in danger. I had known it since the day I walked down that aisle. But knowing it in theory, and feeling it claw at the edges of your heart, were two very different things. I wanted to tell myself that it didn't matter, that what happened last night hadn't changed anything, that I was still just his obligation, his collateral. But I couldn't. Not after the way his hands had trembled against my skin. Not after the way his voice had broken when he whispered my name. I spent the morning pacing through the house, unable to sit still, every sound making me flinch, every silence worse than the noise. I found myself wandering into his study, the room where I had seen him vulnerable for the first time, and though it still smelled faintly of him, smoke, leather, something distinctly male, it felt emptier than before, as if the fire that had burned there had gone out for good. His desk was meticulously organized, as always, though one folder lay open, papers scattered across the surface as if he had left in a hurry. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that. But curiosity isn't a choice. It's an instinct, especially when it comes to the people who haunt you. The papers were maps, photographs, documents filled with names and dates and places I didn't recognize, but one name repeated itself over and over, written in his precise, hard script, Rossetti. And beneath it, another word, written once, smaller, almost hidden in the margin, traitor. I didn't understand, not yet. But something inside me shifted, a cold, creeping suspicion that whatever battle he was fighting wasn't just about territory or power. It was personal. The day dragged on in slow, heavy silence. I tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. I tried to eat, but the food turned to ash in my mouth. Every clock in the house seemed to mock me with its steady ticking, marking time in all the wrong ways. Every passing hour without him felt like another thread unraveling inside me. When dusk fell, the sky bleeding into deep shades of red and violet, I stood again at the window, watching the drive for any sign of headlights. My reflection stared back at me, tired eyes, hair in disarray, lips still bruised from his kiss, and I hated how I looked like a woman waiting. Waiting was weakness, and weakness had no place in this world. But still, I waited. It was Carmela who broke the silence. She entered without knocking, her face pale, her hands clutching the edge of her apron like she needed to hold on to something solid. "There's news," she said quietly. My throat tightened. What kind of news? She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window before she spoke again. "The boss went to meet with the Rossettis in the city. There was a shootout at the docks. They say—" She stopped, biting her lip. "They say he hasn't been seen since." The world went still. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, unreal, unbearable. I wanted to ask what she meant, how anyone could not have seen him, how a man like Lorenzo Valenti, who walked into rooms and made the air itself bow to him, could simply vanish. But the words wouldn't come. Carmela placed a trembling hand on my arm. "Please, Signora, stay inside. If something happens, the men will handle it. You must not leave this house." But as soon as she left, I knew I couldn't obey. Because if Lorenzo was out there, bleeding, fighting, or worse, I couldn't stay behind these walls and wait to be told what fate had already decided. I couldn't be the quiet wife, the obedient pawn, the woman who stood in silk nightgowns and prayed for someone else to save her. Not anymore. I went to his study again, searching for something, anything, that could lead me to where he'd gone. My hands shook as I rifled through his desk, and then, tucked inside a folder marked with his family crest, I found it. A slip of paper with an address written in his handwriting. The docks. The moment I saw it, I knew. The same docks where his brother had died. The same place where his nightmares began. I pressed the paper to my chest, the ink smudging slightly beneath my fingers, and for the first time since I'd entered his world, I understood that love, if that's what this was, didn't make you safe. It made you reckless. It made you brave. And as I stepped into the hallway, my mind set, my heart hammering like a drum, I heard his voice in my memory, low and cold and unyielding. "You'll learn what happens to people who mistake freedom for safety. But I wasn't looking for safety anymore. I was looking for him, and I didn't care what it cost me to find him. I don't remember how I got to the car. I don't remember grabbing the keys, or the way my hands trembled so violently I could barely start the engine. All I remember is the pounding in my chest, that frantic rhythm that didn't feel like a heartbeat anymore but a warning, a sound that said hurry, hurry before it's too late. The rain had started again, soft at first, then harder, a relentless curtain of silver that blurred the world into streaks of gray, and still I drove, headlights cutting through the fog, the road a winding blur beneath me as the city crept closer with every mile. I told myself I was only going to find him, to make sure he was alive, to see him just once more if that's all fate would allow. But somewhere deep down, beneath the panic and the fear, there was something else, something sharp and heavy that I didn't want to look at too closely, because even then, before I knew the truth, I think I already felt it. I think a part of me knew that what I was rushing toward wasn't salvation, but the wreckage of everything I had started to believe in. The docks appeared like the bones of a forgotten world, skeletal cranes rising against the storm, the water black and restless beneath the flashing lights of patrol cars, and the faint echo of distant shouting. I parked far enough away that no one saw me, and slipped through the maze of containers, the air thick with the metallic scent of rain and gunpowder, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. And then I saw him. He stood near the edge of the pier, his back to me, his white shirt clinging to his body, soaked through from the rain. Around him, men were gathering the dead, dragging bodies into the shadows, their movements mechanical, practiced. The violence was over now, the aftermath quiet but still vibrating with that energy that comes after chaos, when the world hasn't yet remembered how to breathe. "Lorenzo," I whispered, my voice trembling as I stepped closer. He turned slowly, and when our eyes met, something in me cracked wide open. There was blood on his sleeve, streaked across his jaw, but his face, God, his face, was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that only comes from someone who has already lost everything that could hurt him. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low, even, but there was a flicker in it, a tremor that betrayed surprise, maybe even fear. "I came to find you," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop. "Them. They said you were gone. They said—" He cut me off, his expression tightening. "You shouldn't be here, Serena. This isn't your world." "Isn't it?" I demanded, taking another step toward him. "You made it mine when you married me. You dragged me into it the moment you said my name at that altar." For a moment, he just looked at me, the rain falling between us like a wall. Then he turned away, his shoulders rigid. "Go home." "No." The word tore from me, sharp and desperate. "Not until you tell me the truth." His jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck tightening. "The truth won't save you." "I don't want to be saved," I said, my voice rising, shaking. "I want to know why you married me. I want to know what this war is really about. I want to know what you're not saying." He turned then, his eyes dark, his face carved from fury and something deeper. "You want the truth?" he said, his voice low, dangerous. "Fine, you'll have it. But don't say I didn't warn you." The thunder cracked overhead, as if the sky itself was trying to drown his words, but nothing could mute them once they began. "Your father," he said, each word deliberate, heavy, poisonous. "He wasn't a victim of this war. He started it." The world tilted, the sound of the rain fading into a distant hum. "What are you talking about?" "He made a deal with my family years ago," Lorenzo continued, his voice flat but his eyes burning. "A deal that cost us everything. He promised loyalty, protection, silence, and he sold us out to the Rossettis for money, for power, for greed. It was his betrayal that got my brother killed. Matteo trusted him, trusted your family, and it was Matteo's trust that got him shot on these very docks." I felt the ground disappear beneath me. The rain, the wind, the flashing lights, all of it blurred into one endless wave of sound and motion that I couldn't hold on to. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not true. My father, Your father," he said, cutting me off, "used his own daughter as collateral to save himself. He knew I'd come for him eventually, so he offered you instead. And I took you." The words hit me like bullets. "You took me?" He didn't look away. "At first, yes. You were supposed to be a weapon, Serena. A way to make him bleed without firing a single shot. I wanted him to see what it felt like to lose something he loved. I wanted him to suffer the way I did when they dragged Mateo's body out of the river." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My body felt cold, my fingers numb. Every memory I had of him, every touch, every glance, every whisper in the dark, rewound itself in my mind until it felt like all of it, every beautiful, terrible second, had been a lie. "So all of it," I said finally, my voice breaking. "The wedding, the rules, the warnings. It was all revenge." He flinched almost imperceptibly. "It was supposed to be." "Supposed to be?" I repeated, the words sharp, hollow. "What does that even mean?" "It means," he said quietly, "that somewhere along the way, I forgot why I married you. I forgot what you were supposed to be to me. And that—" He exhaled shakily, his gaze flickering toward the water. "That is my mistake." The ache in my chest was unbearable, spreading like fire through my ribs. "Your mistake," I said softly, the words tasting like ash. "Is that what I am to you now? A mistake?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a heartbeat the mask slipped. The pain in his eyes was raw, almost human. "No," he whispered. "That's the problem." I turned away, tears burning my throat but refusing to fall. The rain soaked through my clothes, cold and heavy, but I barely felt it. My mind was spinning, replaying every word he'd ever said, every warning, every touch, and suddenly they all made sense in the worst possible way. "You used me," I said finally, my voice shaking. "And I let you." "Serena, don't," I said sharply, turning back to him. "Don't say my name like that. Don't pretend you didn't know what you were doing. You took everything from me, my choice, my peace, my life, and you wrapped it in the illusion of love." His eyes closed for a moment, his jaw tight, his voice breaking when he spoke again. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't hate myself for it every time I look at you? Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because," he said softly, almost desperately, "the moment I did, you'd be gone." I stared at him, my heart splintering beneath the weight of it. "You should have let me go anyway." The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the sound of rain and the echo of everything we'd just destroyed. Finally, he stepped closer, his voice low, rough, shaking. "I can't undo what I've done, Serena. But if I could trade my life for yours, I would. Every damn time." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But belief was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. So I stepped back, away from him, from the rain, from the ruin of us, and whispered, "Then maybe it's time you start proving it." And before he could stop me, I turned and walked away, the sound of the water crashing against the docks behind me, his voice calling my name swallowed by the storm. For the first time since I married him, I didn't look back. There are moments when the world seems to split apart quietly, not with explosions or thunder, but with the subtle, shattering sound of something inside you breaking beyond repair, and that's exactly how it felt in the days after the truth came out. As though I was walking through a world I recognized only in shape, but not in substance. As though every familiar thing had been hollowed out and filled with something darker, heavier, more unbearable than pain itself. I had left the docks that night with the rain still pounding down, my clothes clinging to my skin, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the steering wheel, but I didn't cry. Not then, because crying felt too small, too human for what was happening inside me. I didn't know if I hated Lorenzo, or if I hated myself more for still wanting him, for still feeling the ghost of his touch on my skin, even as his confession burned through my chest like acid. Back at the mansion, the air felt different, sharper somehow, thinner, like the house itself was bracing for impact. The staff moved in whispers, their eyes flicking toward me and then away, as though I were something fragile or cursed. And maybe I was, because everything I touched seemed to end in ruin. Carmela tried to speak to me once, her wrinkled hand reaching out as if she could comfort me, but I pulled away. There was no comfort left to give. I spent that night in Lorenzo's study, sitting in the chair he always used, surrounded by the scent of him, smoke, leather, the faintest trace of whiskey. And for hours, I stared at the maps on his desk, the documents, the photographs of men whose names meant nothing to me, but whose deaths had carved lines into his soul. It was there, in that dim, suffocating silence, that I began to realize how deep the rot ran, how none of us had ever really had a choice. We were all pieces in someone else's game, my father, Lorenzo, me, and every move had been written long before I ever stepped into that church. When dawn came, I made a decision that felt like both a rebellion and a surrender. I had to face my father. I found him at his estate outside the city, the same place where I had grown up, where I had once believed safety was something you could hold in your hands if you just followed the rules. The guards at the gate hesitated when they saw me, their eyes flickering with recognition and unease, but I didn't give them time to think. "Tell him his daughter's here," I said, and there must have been something in my voice that made them obey, because a few minutes later, I was walking through the front doors into the house that had once been my home and now felt like a mausoleum of lies. My father was waiting in his study, his posture still proud, his suit immaculate, but his face. I had never noticed how old he looked until that moment, how tired, how hollow. "Serena," he said, smiling faintly, like nothing had changed. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "Why?" I asked, my voice sharp, trembling. "Because Lorenzo might find me? Or because your lies finally caught up to you?" His expression faltered, just slightly, and I knew then that he understood exactly what I'd come for. "Whatever he told you, it's true," I said, cutting him off. "All of it. You sold out his family. You caused his brother's death, and then you gave him me to save yourself." He sighed, the sound. Weary, but not remorseful, more like a man irritated by a child's persistence. "It wasn't that simple. It never is," I said bitterly. "You always had reasons, justifications. But tell me, Father, when you signed away my life, what reason did you use then?" He looked at me for a long time, and then, with a kind of cold detachment that made my blood run cold, he said, "I did what I had to do. Lorenzo would have destroyed everything. The business, our allies, the name your mother and I built. Someone had to stop him. And if it had to be through you, then so be it." I took a step back, the breath catching in my throat. "You used me." He didn't deny it. Something inside me hardened then, something I hadn't known I was capable of. The girl who once obeyed, who once accepted silence as survival, was gone. "You don't get to speak about survival," I said quietly. "You don't get to use my life to clean up your sins." He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of engines roared outside, multiple cars pulling up fast, tires screeching against gravel. My father's face went pale. "Get down," he hissed, but it was already too late. The windows shattered under the force of gunfire, glass exploding inward, the air filling with the deafening thunder of bullets. I ducked instinctively, my heart slamming against my ribs, and through the chaos I saw men flooding into the room. Rossetti men, armed and relentless, their faces blurred by rain and fury. My father reached for the gun in his drawer, but before he could raise it, a shot rang out, and he staggered back, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading across his shirt like a spreading shadow. "Serena!" he shouted, his voice breaking, but I couldn't move. The world was spinning, the smoke burning my throat, and then, through the haze, I saw him. Lorenzo. He burst through the doorway like something torn from a nightmare, his coat whipping behind him, his gun steady in his hand, his eyes burning with that same ruthless fire I'd seen on the night he told me not to expect love from him. Except now, there was something else there, something raw and desperate, something that looked like fear. He moved fast, too fast, each shot precise, controlled. The Rossetti men fell one after another, and when the last one hit the ground, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. He turned to me, his chest heaving, rain and sweat mingling on his skin. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, unable to speak. He crossed to my father, who was struggling to stand, blood dripping from his hand. Lorenzo's expression was unreadable, a mixture of fury, grief, and something colder than either. "Don't," I whispered, stepping between them. "Please, Lorenzo, not like this." He looked at me then, and for a moment, I saw the man from that night, the one who had held me as if I were the last good thing left in the world. But then his gaze hardened again, the mask sliding back into place. "He took everything from me," he said quietly. "Everything. And if you kill him," I said, my voice shaking, "you'll lose what's left of yourself." For a heartbeat, it seemed like he might listen. His hand trembled slightly, the barrel of the gun lowering just a fraction, and then my father laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You think he's capable of redemption?" he sneered. "You think a man like that can change? He'll destroy you too, Serena, just like he destroyed everyone else." Lorenzo's jaw tightened, the tendons in his neck taut, his finger brushing the trigger. "Lorenzo," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Please." For one terrible moment the world stopped. Then he fired. The sound was deafening. My father collapsed to the floor, a crimson bloom spreading beneath him, and I screamed, my hands shaking as I dropped to my knees beside him. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and he looked at me, not with love, not with regret, but with something closer to resignation. "I told you," he rasped, blood on his lips. "He'll never save you." And then he was still. The gun slipped from Lorenzo's hand, clattering against the marble, and he looked at me, just looked, his face pale, his eyes wild, as if only now realizing what he had done. "Serena," he said softly, reaching for me. I stepped back, tears streaming down my face, my voice shaking so hard it barely sounded like my own. "You promised me you wouldn't make me like you," I whispered. His expression crumpled, and he took a step toward me. But before he could speak, a gunshot rang out from somewhere behind us, sharp and echoing, and his body jerked as the bullet tore through him, red blooming across his chest like a terrible flower. "Lorenzo!" I screamed, catching him as he fell, his weight heavy against me, his blood warm on my hands. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused, searching for me. "Serena," he breathed, his voice faint. "I told you not to expect love from me." He coughed, the sound wet, broken. "But it's all I have left." His hand fell from mine, and the world dissolved into sirens and smoke, and the echo of his words that would not stop repeating in my head. And as the darkness closed in around us, I realized with bone-deep certainty that love, in our world, was never meant to save anyone. It was only ever meant to destroy. They say time dulls pain, that grief softens at the edges until it becomes something you can live beside rather than something that devours you whole. But I have learned that time doesn't erase anything. It only changes the shape of the wounds, turning sharp agony into something quieter, something that hums beneath your skin like an old melody you can't forget, no matter how many times you try to drown it out. The days after that night were a blur of sound and silence, of white hospital walls and the smell of antiseptic and smoke still clinging to my clothes, of questions I didn't answer and names I couldn't say aloud without feeling them crumble in my throat. They told me Lorenzo was alive, that the bullet had missed his heart by inches, that he was lucky, though lucky was such a strange word to use for a man who had lost so much. I didn't feel lucky either. I felt hollow, weightless, as if I had left a part of myself somewhere on that blood-soaked floor beside my father's body. I remember sitting by his hospital bed in those first days, the machines humming softly around us, his skin pale against the sheets, his breath shallow but steady. He looked peaceful in a way he never had in life, stripped of the armor he wore so well, his features softer, younger even, like the ghost of the boy he must have been before the world taught him to kill. I watched him sleep and thought about all the things he had never said, all the things I had been too afraid to ask. And I wondered if love was really something we had shared, or if it had only been the illusion of two broken souls clinging to each other in the dark, mistaking survival for something sacred. When he woke, it wasn't cinematic. There was no dramatic gasp, no whispered declarations. His eyes opened slowly, hazy with painkillers and exhaustion. And when they finally found me, something in them flickered. Recognition, disbelief, sorrow. And then his hand reached weakly toward mine. I took it before I could think, my fingers trembling as they wrapped around his. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, his voice a rasp that barely carried across the room. "Neither should you," I whispered back, and despite everything, the faintest smile touched his lips, a ghost of the arrogance that used to infuriate me, the one that hid all his grief. He was too weak to argue after that, and so we sat in silence, our joined hands saying everything that words couldn't. Days bled into weeks. The house was quieter now, emptier, as if it too was mourning. My father's empire collapsed within days of his death, devoured by men who had waited too long in the shadows for their turn to claim the throne. The Rossettis scattered, their leadership shattered after Lorenzo's retaliation, and though the papers called it a shift in power, I knew it was something else entirely. It was the end of an era. When Lorenzo came home, he was different, slower, quieter. The violence that had always radiated from him like heat was still there, but it had dimmed, tempered by something heavier. Guilt, maybe, or love, or both. He walked through the house like a ghost learning to live again, and though we didn't talk about that night, it lingered between us like smoke, impossible to ignore. One evening, weeks later, I found him standing in the garden just before sunset, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his scars catching the light like faint silver threads. The air smelled of earth and rain, and for a long moment I just watched him, trying to memorize the way the wind moved through his hair, the way his shoulders rose and fell with each slow breath. When he turned and saw me, he didn't speak right away. He just looked at me, and for the first time, there was no distance in his gaze, no mask, no pretense. "I killed your father," he said finally, his voice low, even. "You should hate me." "I did," I said softly, stepping closer. "But hate doesn't last forever. It just changes form." He nodded slowly, his eyes dropping to the ground. "And what has yours become?" I hesitated, searching for the right words, but there weren't any. Understanding, maybe, or something close to it. "You were right once. Love and hate aren't opposites. They're made of the same fire." He looked up then, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. "You shouldn't have to understand me," he said, his voice rough, his eyes shining with something that looked like regret. "You should have run the moment I let you." "Maybe," I whispered, smiling sadly. "But I didn't, and I think part of you never wanted me to." He exhaled slowly, a sound that was almost a laugh, though there was no joy in it. "I told you not to expect love from me," he murmured, almost as if to himself. "I didn't," I said quietly, taking another step until I was close enough to feel his breath against my skin. "But I found it anyway." For a long moment, he just looked at me, And then, without warning, he pulled me into his arms. It wasn't the kind of embrace that promised forever. It was the kind that said, "This is all we have, and it has to be enough." His heart beat slow and steady beneath my cheek, and for the first time, I realized that love didn't always have to be pure or kind, or safe to be real. Sometimes it was sharp-edged and bruised and born from ashes, and maybe that was the only kind of love people like us ever got. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in gold and shadow, he spoke again, so quietly I almost missed it. "I don't know what happens now," he said. "Neither do I replied, and for once that uncertainty didn't scare me. Maybe that's the point. We stood there until the stars began to emerge, one by one, tiny sparks of light against the dark. He reached for my hand, and this time I didn't hesitate. His fingers were warm, steady, real. There were still ghosts between us, too many names, too many scars. But there was something else now too, something fragile and defiant, and almost holy, the will to begin again. In the days that followed, we spoke little of the past. There were things too heavy for words, things that could only be carried in silence. He spent his time rebuilding what had been lost, but this time, his empire grew, not from fear, but from restraint. He no longer needed to prove he could burn the world to control it. And I learned to live in the quiet again, though it was a different kind of quiet than before, one I had chosen rather than been given. Sometimes I would find him standing by the window at night, the moonlight catching the faint line of the scar across his chest, and I would think about how fragile he looked in that moment, how human. Sometimes, when the air was still, he would reach for me without speaking, and I would let him, because forgiveness, I had learned, doesn't always come with words. Sometimes it's just the act of staying when everything inside you wants to run. It would be a lie to say we lived happily ever after. We didn't. We lived honestly instead. Two broken souls trying to make sense of the pieces that were left. And maybe that's what love really is. Not salvation, not redemption, but the quiet agreement to hold what's left after the fire burns everything else away. Now, when I stand at the edge of the garden in the evenings, watching the light fade and listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his footsteps behind me, I think about the night he told me not to expect love from him, and I realize how wrong he was. Because love did come, not softly, not kindly, but fiercely, destructively, with the kind of force that changes everything it touches. And though it left scars, though it demanded everything and gave nothing easily, I wouldn't undo it, not for all the peace in the world, because peace is silent. But love, even the kind born in darkness, is alive, and it is mine.